There is a church in the south of England that has no right to still be standing. Walk through the town of Wimborne on a grey November morning, and you will find it at the centre of everything. Two massive towers of warm Jurassic limestone rising above the rooftops, the stone worn smooth by 1,000 years of wind and rain. The silence inside so dense it feels like something pressed against your chest. The building is enormous, heavy, permanent in a way that very few things built by human hands ever feel. And that permanence is not an accident. It is not the result of careful preservation or extraordinary luck. It is the result of something far stranger, the indifference of enemies who came not to preserve, but to destroy. The Vikings who swept through Dorset in the autumn of 1013 burned everything in sight, every timber wall, every wooden beam, every door, every fence, every structure that could be reduced to ash. They burned the nunnery of Wimborne to the ground, one of the oldest and most venerated religious houses in England, with a thoroughness that spoke less of hatred than of efficiency. But the stone church at the center of the complex didn't fall, not because anyone defended it, not because God intervened, because it was built from stone, and stone does not burn. The warriors moved on, the smoke cleared, and what remained standing in the ruins of a 300-year-old institution was this: a single building, stripped of everything around it, surrounded by ash, still whole. That building is Wimborne Minster, and the story of how it came to be there and why its survival would quietly reshape the next 1,000 years of English history begins not with the fire, but with a woman who gave up a throne to build something that would outlast every throne that came after it. If stories like this one, where survival is stranger than destruction, and where the things we build outlast the people who try to erase them, resonate with you, consider subscribing to this channel and leave a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Every comment reminds me that these stories are still reaching people, and that matters more than you might think. To understand what Wimborne really was before the fire, we need to go back more than 3 centuries, to the very beginning of the 8th century, when England was not yet England, and the land we now call Dorset was still the western frontier of a Saxon kingdom fighting to hold itself together. The early 700s were a time of extraordinary fragility. The Kingdom of Wessex, the most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon realms, stretched across the south of Britain, its borders constantly tested by rival kingdoms to the north and east, its internal politics shaped by a web of dynastic marriages, religious alliances, and the slow, grinding effort of converting a warrior culture to Christianity. The church was not separate from this politics. It was woven through it. Bishops held land, abbots raised armies, and monasteries, especially the great double monasteries, which housed both men and women under a single rule, functioned as centers of education, record-keeping, medicine, and political legitimacy, in a world where almost everything else was temporary. To found a monastery was not just a religious act. It was a statement of permanence in a landscape where almost nothing was permanent. It was a claim. We were here, and we intend to remain. The valley of the River Allen, where Wimborne sits, was already sacred ground by the time the Saxons arrived. The river ran cold and clear through low hills covered in oak and ash. The land was fertile. The position was defensible without being isolated. And sometime around the year 705, a woman of extraordinary resolution arrived in that valley and decided to build something that would last. Her name was Cuthberga. She was the sister of Ine, King of Wessex, born into the most powerful royal family in southern England, raised in a court where power was measured in land, alliances, and the number of men who would die at your command. She had been married to Aldfrith, King of Northumbria, one of the most culturally sophisticated rulers in all of Britain, a man who collected manuscripts, corresponded with scholars across Europe, and governed a kingdom that had produced some of the finest religious art of the age. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary match, and she walked away from it. The precise reasons are lost to time. The chronicles record only that the marriage was dissolved, and that Cuthberga entered the religious life with a decisiveness that suggested this had not been a crisis of faith, but a long-held intention finally acted upon. She did not retreat quietly. She did not simply join an existing institution. She went to the valley of the Allen and built one from nothing, a double monastery. housing both monks and nuns under her personal direction, organized with a rigor and ambition that reflected everything she had absorbed from the Northumbrian court she had left behind. The institution she founded was not small. Within a generation, it would house more than 500 nuns. It would become a training ground for missionaries who would carry Christianity into the pagan lands of Northern Europe. It would attract scholars, pilgrims, and royal patrons from across the Saxon world, and at its center, from the very beginning, was a stone church, built not of timber like almost everything else in 8th century England, but of dressed stone, quarried and shaped and fitted together with a permanence that every other building in the complex conspicuously lacked. That choice was not accidental. Cuthberga had seen enough of the world to know that timber burns, stone endures. She built accordingly. But something was already wrong at the foundations of Wimborne, not in the stone or the mortar, but in the nature of what it represented. An institution of this size and prestige in early medieval England was never just a religious house. It was a political object, and political objects attract dangerous attention. The first signs of that danger came not from outside, but from within the royal family that had created Wimborne in the first place. By the middle of the 9th century, the Minster had become so closely associated with the kings of Wessex that it had begun to function as something close to a dynastic mausoleum. When Ethelred IV, elder brother of Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, a man who had spent most of his reign fighting the Danish Great Army that was slowly dismantling Anglo-Saxon England, died in the spring of 871, his body was brought to Wimborne. He was buried there with royal honors. His tomb became one of the most significant sacred sites in the kingdom, a physical anchor connecting the reigning dynasty to its dead, its history, and its claim to legitimacy. But a tomb can be a weapon as well as a memorial. And within a generation, that tomb would be used as exactly that. Ethelred's son, a young man named Ethelwald, had grown up watching his uncle Alfred transform Wessex into the dominant power of England, building fortified towns, reorganizing the army, creating a written legal code, commissioning translations of Latin texts into the English vernacular. It was an extraordinary reign, and Ethelwald, who believed he had a stronger claim to the throne than Alfred's son Edward, watched it all with a resentment that grew into something close to obsession. When Edward the Elder succeeded Alfred in 899, Ethelwald made his move. He seized the royal estate at Wimborne. He barricaded himself inside the Minster, beside his father's tomb, beside the bones of the man whose blood he shared, and declared that he would either rule from there or die there. It was a calculated act of political theater. He was using his father's grave as a stage. He was daring Edward to desecrate a royal tomb by forcing a battle inside a sacred church. For a few weeks, it looked as though it might work. Edward moved his army into position. The standoff held. And then, in the night, Ethelwald slipped out of Wimborne with a small group of followers and fled north, not to another Saxon kingdom, but to the Danes. He rode to Northumbria and placed himself under Danish protection. He had failed. And in failing, he had set in motion something that would return to Wimborne with fire 2 generations later, because the Danes remembered who had come to them, and they remembered where he had come from. The decades that followed Ethelwald's flight were not peaceful, but they were survivable. The Minster continued to function. The nuns continued their work. The stone church continued to stand at the center of the complex, its towers visible from miles across the flat Dorset countryside, its bells marking the canonical hours with a regularity that the surrounding world conspicuously lacked. But the world was changing in ways that no amount of institutional rigor could hold back. The Danish raids that had defined Alfred's reign did not end with the treaties and the battles and the careful diplomacy of his successors. They intensified. By the 990s, England was bleeding. Danish fleets arrived every summer, moving up the rivers and along the coast. With a speed and violence that the local Saxon feared, the citizen militia that formed the backbone of English defense could rarely match. In 998, a Danish army sailed up the River Frome and devastated the region around Dorset with almost no resistance. They came, they burned, they took, and they left before any organized defense could be mounted. Wimborne was close enough to the coast to feel the fear of those years settle into its walls like damp. The nuns continued their prayers. The monks copied their manuscripts. The bells rang. But every person inside those walls knew that the raids were getting closer, that the pattern was accelerating, that something was building toward a conclusion that prayers alone could not prevent. What no one inside Wimborne could have known, what no chronicle recorded, what no survivor remembered clearly enough to write down, was that the end, when it came, would arrive not as a battle but as a process, not as glory but as fire, not as a story worth telling but as an absence. Before we reach that moment, before we follow the smoke rising over the River Allen in the autumn of 1013, take a second to think about what it took to keep a place like Wimborne alive for 300 years. The stone church didn't maintain itself. The manuscripts didn't copy themselves. The 500 women who lived inside those walls ate every day, prayed every day, worked every day, in a system that required constant effort to sustain. There were fields to tend, animals to manage, books to protect from moisture and mold, roofs to repair, candles to make, medicines to prepare. There was a library. There were students. There were visitors from across England and from the continent. All of it required organization. All of it required discipline. All of it required the kind of institutional will that only survives when the people inside an institution still believe in what it represents. And if you find yourself wondering whether that kind of belief can hold against the weight of a world that has decided for its own reasons that your time is over, subscribe to this channel and stay with me, because the answer is more complicated than you might expect. The year 1013 was not supposed to be the end. By the early 11th century, England had survived so much that it had begun to develop a kind of institutional memory of survival, a collective belief, reinforced by decades of narrow escapes and successful defenses, that the things worth preserving would somehow find a way to endure. King Ethelred II, known to history as the Unready, a nickname that derived from a bitter Old English pun on his name, had spent his entire reign trying to manage the Danish threat through a combination of military resistance, diplomatic payments, and strategic marriage. The payments, known as danegeld, had been enormous. Millions of silver pennies extracted from an already exhausted English economy and sent across the North Sea in exchange for promises of peace that were broken as reliably as they were made. The marriages had produced a son, Edward, who would one day be called the Confessor, but none of it had stopped the erosion. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, arrived in England not to raid but to conquer. He moved through the north of the country with terrifying speed, receiving submissions from town after town, his army growing as local lords calculated that resistance was worse than surrender. By autumn, he was in the south, and somewhere in his march through Dorset, a detachment of his forces reached Wimborne. What happened next was recorded in fragments, enough to reconstruct the outline, not enough to feel the weight of it. The nunnery was destroyed, the timber buildings burned. The structures that had been built from wood over 3 centuries of expansion and repair collapsed into ash with a speed that made the whole span of their existence feel suddenly brief. The women inside, some of them scholars, some of them healers, some of them the daughters of the most powerful families in England, scattered or were captured or simply vanished from the historical record, as people caught in catastrophes tend to do. And the stone church stood in the middle of it all untouched. Not because it was defended, not because anyone fought for it, because it was made of stone, and stone does not burn. The Vikings moved on. Sweyn was declared King of England before the year was out. Ethelred fled to Normandy, and Wimborne was left standing in its own ruins, a stone skeleton surrounded by ash, the only thing that remained of 3 centuries of accumulated life. The nunnery was never rebuilt. That fact deserves to linger for a moment. The institution that Cuthberga had founded, that had trained missionaries and sheltered queens and buried kings, simply ceased to exist. The community of women she had assembled, the largest community of religious women in Saxon England, was gone. No chronicle mourned them at length. No foundation was established to continue their work. History moved forward, as it does, without pausing to account for what had been lost, but the stone church remained, and in 1043, Edward the Confessor, Ethelred's son, returned from Normandy, newly crowned King of England, refounded the institution at Wimborne, not as a nunnery, not as a double monastery, as a college of secular canons, a dean, 4 prebends, 4 vicars, 4 deacons and 5 singers, a smaller institution, a quieter one organized around the liturgy rather than around the education of missionaries or the training of royal daughters. The transformation was total. The thing that Cuthberga had built was gone. What replaced it was something more modest, more manageable, and perhaps more likely to survive in a world that had demonstrated clearly and violently. That ambition was no protection against fire. Between 1120 and 1180, the Normans came to Wimborne and did what the Normans did everywhere they went in England. They rebuilt. The Saxon stonework was stripped, redesigned, expanded. The towers were raised. The nave was extended. The warm Jurassic limestone was shaped and fitted with a precision that the Saxon builders had never quite achieved. What emerged from those decades of construction was the building that stands today. Massive, twin-towered, asymmetrical in the way that medieval buildings often are. The result of generations of decisions made by people who would never see the finished result, layering their stone over the stone of those who came before. Inside, the centuries accumulated without plan or coordination. A 14th century astronomical clock was installed in the West Tower, a mechanical instrument of extraordinary sophistication, built at a time when the model of the universe it depicted was still considered accurate. It showed the Earth at the center of everything, with the sun and moon moving around it in their ordained paths. The clock still runs. It has been running, with maintenance and repair, for nearly 700 years. It has outlasted the cosmology it was built to represent. Nearby, a chained library was assembled, one of only 5 surviving chained libraries in England, a collection of books secured to their shelves by iron chains, so that they could be read but not removed. The chains are still there. The books are still there. In the south choir aisle, the tomb of King Ethelred thus remains. The same tomb that his son Ethelwald used as a political prop in his failed bid for the throne. The same tomb that stood at the center of Wimborne when the Danish warriors arrived and found it still standing in the ruins of everything that had burned around it. And beside it, added in the 15th century, the tomb of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and his Duchess, 2 people who would have seemed in their own time to have no particular claim on eternity. But their granddaughter would become the mother of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, the dynasty that would reshape England completely. The chain connecting that tomb in Wimborne to the throne of England runs through some of the bloodiest decades in English history, and it begins here, in this stone building, in this valley, in this place that survived because its enemies had no use for things that wouldn't burn. Walk through Wimborne Minster today, and what you feel if you are paying attention is not the weight of religion. It is the weight of continuity, the accumulated pressure of everything that has happened inside these walls and around them and because of them, pressing down through the centuries into the stone floor beneath your feet. The astronomical clock still ticks in the West Tower, marking time with its pre-Copernican gears, measuring a universe that no longer exists. The chained books still hang from their iron chains in the library above the vestry, their pages holding words that the women who once lived here may have read before the fire. The tomb of Ethelred is still there, still visited, still photographed, still occasionally touched by people who cannot quite explain why they feel the need to make contact with something that old. Outside, the twin towers rise above the market town the same way they have risen above it for 900 years. The same height, the same stone, the same slightly asymmetrical profile against whatever sky happens to be overhead. The Vikings came and took everything that could burn. What remained became a college. What remained became a Norman cathedral. What remained became a library. What remained became a dynastic tomb. What remained is still standing, not because it was the strongest thing in Wimborne, not because it was the most important, because it was made of the one material that the fire could not touch. And sometimes that is enough.